Now, if I wanted to reflect, Martin, I'd say that, part of your second sermon in this series, when you talked about coincidences and God incidences, gave rise to a lot of this discussion. If I remember rightly, we concluded that sermon by a prayer, Lord, I'm so thankful that there are no coincidences in my life, just God incidences. And that really made people stop and think. And I don't know if you want to expand a bit further what you meant by that.
Well, hello and welcome to Going Deeper. It's that time when we take our current sermon series and just maybe pick a few topics and go a little bit deeper. And that's exactly what we have done with my conversation with Dr. Debra Reid, lecturer at the world-renowned Spurgeon College in London. And we're just going to look at some of the topics that have come up from our sermon series on Ruth, an Old Testament story, and just see how it applies to our lives. And I think you'll agree with me that there may be more questions than answers when we come out the other end. But actually, it's a really good thing just to stop and to think and to consider what we believe and how it applies to our everyday life. Do like and subscribe to our Hawley Baptist Church YouTube channel, and do remember that you can follow us on Facebook and also Instagram. Do just search Hawley Baptist Church. And if you happen to be around Hawley on a Sunday morning, then do come along to one of our morning services. We start at 10:30, or you can join us on the live stream at 11:15. So we're going to delve into this conversation with Debra Reid. We're going to be talking things about God's sovereignty, God's involvement in our lives. Does God even care about our everyday life and the things that we do? Do join me and enjoy this conversation with Dr. Debra Reid. Well, hello, Debra. Thank you for joining me. It's great to have you with us. As part, we go a little bit deeper with our sermon series that we've just come to the end of on Ruth, and I think hopefully you've got some important and interesting insights into not only the story of Ruth, but God and the Old Testament and the things the Bible tells us. So I'm really excited about what you've got to say. And do you want to say a little bit about who you are and maybe what you do?
Mm-hmm. Yes, so I'm Debra Reid. I'm a member at Hawley Baptist Church, and have been a member for many years now. I work at Spurgeon College and have particular responsibility for our undergraduate programmes, and my special area is Old Testament studies.
Yeah, in fact, you're Dr. Debra Reid, aren't you?
Only in the eyes of people who don't know me very well. Yeah.
So you have this particular speciality in the Old Testament. Are there any particular favourite bits you're really interested in within the Old Testament?
Mm-hmm. Well, I suppose I should say Esther as a book, because I've written the Tyndale commentary on Esther, so I spent quite a few years studying the book of Esther. So I guess that's a special area of interest. I did my PhD looking at the book of Isaiah, looking through the eyes of a medieval Arabic commentary on Isaiah. So that's also an area of interest to me.
I have to admit, Isaiah is a book I kind of avoid because it's complicated.
I think every book in the Old Testament is complicated in some way or another.
Depends how deep you go with it, I suppose, doesn't it?
Indeed.
So from your point of view, there's enough there for you to do a PhD on. So you know what you're talking about, and you also know what other people are talking about in terms of the Old Testament and different views and understanding. So it'd be really good to get your insight in this, which is a very small book, and maybe a book which it's easy from the outset just to see it as a nice little story. But do you want to tell us a little bit about Ruth, about its context, and anything else that we might be useful to know about it?
You're very kind in saying that I might have something of interest to say about the book of Ruth. I think one thing you discover when you work with the Bible is that you end up with more questions sometimes than answers in your study. And I guess that's true of any area of study, but it's certainly my experience with biblical studies. Yeah, I mean, the Book of Ruth is a bit of an enigma. I mean, scholars say that it can't really be classified in the same way as other books in the Bible might easily be classified, because it's so unusual. It just focuses on one particular family and their experience. It reads as if it's meant to be understood as historical, but at the same time, it doesn't really include an awful lot of historical detail. We have the start setting at the start in Ruth 1, and we have a chronology at the end. But in between, there's not much interest in historical detail and information. And so, a bit stuck when it comes to understanding what Ruth is all about, I guess. I like to think of it, and I think it makes most sense to me to think of the Book of Ruth as the people of Israel recalling a memory in their experience and in their history. So at some point in time, someone thought, do you remember that story about Ruth and the importance of that story, not least in the development of the line of David? And that story was written down. Now, I've said in passing, at some point it was written down because really we don't know when it was written down. We know the setting of the story, that it was written during the period of the Judges, or the story is set in the period of the Judges. But in terms of the writing date of the Book of Ruth, there's a lot more uncertainty. To give you an example from both extremes, some people have suggested that it was written by Samuel, so really early on in Israel's history. Makes it a little bit difficult, the end of the book, which refers to David, but never mind. Others have suggested that Solomon may have been responsible for the production of this book, that he was trying to establish the background of his own reign, being in the Davidic line, and therefore the story of David's ancestry was important to him. Others have suggested that Josiah time makes a good sort of writing date for this book, because Josiah obviously seems to glorify David and his kingship. So it will fit into that sort of mode as well, particularly if we give attention to the end of the book. And still further, so right at the other extreme, are suggestions that this book makes most sense as being a sort of polemic book written during the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, maybe to counteract some of the decisions and considerations at that time, that, for example, mixed marriages shouldn't be allowed in the community of the returned Jews. So many different suggestions about the dating of the actual writing of this text, but it has a setting in the period of the Judges. It's not surprising, therefore, that the author, I think the best conclusion is it's really unknown. But I don't think we should necessarily exclude the possibility that a lady may have written the Book of Ruth. It seems to be written from a female perspective, largely, perhaps. Or certainly shows those tender characteristics we might associate with a writer who is female rather than male. So I just throw that in just to be a bit controversial at the end.
No, I mean, that certainly would make sense. If you read the story, like you said, it has those aspects which are more feminine, if that's not a controversial term, and it's from a female perspective. And I know when I preached the sermon on the second part, and I asked the congregation who likes romance, like films and novels, it was only the women put their hands up. And this is in some ways a romance, but it's much more than that, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, I think most books of the Bible we can approach in varied ways. How we understand a book, not just a biblical book, but any book really, does depend, at least to some degree, on the reader's perspective when they come to the book. So if you're looking for historical detail and information, you might give great credit to the start and the opening of the Book of Ruth, because that's what you're interested in. So you say, oh, it's important historically because it affirms David's ancestry and why there was a Moabite ancestor that's listed, because Ruth gave herself to the service of Israel's God. So, you could look at it from that perspective if you're interested in history. I've mentioned the polemic idea that during the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, mixed marriages were not thought to be a good thing at all. Was this a reminder for God's people that actually the important thing was which God you were aligned with, and who you were serving. And this story is about a Moabite woman, and some people say it is a typical conversion story. It shows how she turned to the God of the Israelites. So there's those ideas about the purpose of the book. There's also ideas that come from the use of Ruth in Jewish contexts. So Ruth, as you know, Martin, is one of the scrolls used at the Jewish festivals. These readings from scripture at Jewish festivals were there to celebrate life and hear life and love. And so we could understand Ruth purely as a book of celebrating something good about life, a bit along the lines as we might think of the Song of Solomon, for example. So there's lots of different ways of approaching this book and seeing it as value more than just as a romantic story. But I guess on the basis where this series so far has been taking us, that you are thinking perhaps particularly about the idea of God's sovereignty as a theme within this text. There's also the theme of God's loving kindness, or how we can reflect God's loving kindness in our relationships with other people. So there's lots of different themes here, things that we can learn from the story. It's not just a romantic story.
And I guess the Book of Ruth gives us a picture of maybe Israel at its best, where it's showing how God steps in and helps, but also how the nation of Israel welcomed a foreigner, lived out those Levitical ideals that God had given them in a positive way, and out of that came the Davidic line, and it's just showing everything working as it should, I guess, in a
Yes.
time of Judges, which was turmoil and everything working very badly.
No, I think certainly during the time of the Judges, this was the exception rather than the rule.
Yes.
Not least if you think about those early chapters of Judges. I was going to say Judges 3, but I'm not sure if it is Judges 3 that talks about the enmity between the Israelites and the Moabites. And that was the norm.
Yeah.
So this story is set aside, but it's something very different from the story that's recorded in Judges, and the enmity between the Israelites and the Moabites, which continued obviously as Israel progressed in its journey.
Yeah. Is there anything that's jumped out of you from this sermon series, the things that we've been looking at?
Yeah, I mean, I've had some really interesting conversations with people, Martin, about this sermon series and some of the things that we've been talking about. And I guess the theme of God's sovereignty over the ordinary events of everyday life is something that has grabbed people's attention and caused them to stop and consider. And it's made me really think again, what do I really believe about the sovereignty of God? Have I got a good understanding, a good grasp of what it means to say that I believe God is king over heaven and earth, that he reigns, that he's sovereign? Now, if I wanted to reflect, Martin, I'd say that, part of your second sermon in this series, when you talked about coincidences and God incidences, gave rise to a lot of this discussion. If I remember rightly, we concluded that sermon by a prayer, Lord, I'm so thankful that there are no coincidences in my life, just God incidences. And that really made people stop and think. And I don't know if you want to expand a bit further on what you meant by that.
Well, to be honest, I nicked it from somewhere else. So, and there's that question, isn't there, about is everything? So when I grew up, I was told things like, so in the traditional Baptist church, that you mustn't use such words such as luck. or chance, because there is no such thing as luck. There is no such thing as chance. Everything is down to God
Mm,
and God's
mm,
influence
yeah.
and God's purposes.
That was
So
also ruled out of my upbringing, luck and
yeah,
chance. So yeah, we have a similar
yeah.
background there.
So you've got, well, we're Baptists. So you've got that at one end, I guess. At the other end, you've got this idea that everything is chance and there's no meaning to life. I suppose it's the atheist kind of humanist idea, isn't it? When we just have to live the best we can with what life throws at us,
Mm,
and we can't do
mm,
anything about that. Um, and I guess it's where do we fit on that spectrum between those two extremes? Is God involved in every single intimate detail? And
mm,
there's some bigger picture, some bigger plan that maybe we don't see and don't understand, and yet we are a cog in a machine that's beyond our understanding. And there are some positives about that particular view and understanding. It can
mm,
help us to feel like we have a purpose and that what we're doing is important. I think there's also some very troubling things that come out of that as well. Um, it can maybe overplay
mm,
our influence and our importance, and that's an interesting question. So, I remember when I was at Spurgeon College, one particular student I was with saying, "Well, God's not really interested in the little things." And Ruth, on one hand, it shows us his interest. God is interested in the lives of Naomi and Ruth and Boaz, and
mm,
this developing romance and relationship and rescuing Naomi. But then at the end, it shows us no, this is all part of God's bigger picture. These are ordinary people involved in an extraordinary
yeah.
plan that led to the birth of David and in latter
Mm,
time, the
mm,
birth of
mm,
Jesus and Messiah. Um, so, but is that the case? I mean, in the Bible, it's ordinary people doing extraordinary things and part of an
mm, mm,
extraordinary
mm,
purpose. That's why they're in the Bible. But is that the case for everyone? Is everyone
mm,
part of an extraordinary plan? We just don't realize it. Is
mm,
God interested in the intimate, minutiae of our lives? That we find a parking space in
mm,
say
mm.
car park, and I guess that's the difficult one. I mean, how do you view it, particularly with your Old Testament scholar hat on,
Oh
and
dear.
and God's sovereignty and God's involvement? Because
Yeah.
we sometimes get a bit messed up by Greek gods, don't we? And that
Yeah.
classic.
I mean, maybe just to rewind a little bit. So I think when we think about God's sovereignty and what the Bible actually tells us, I think it's a good thing to try to work out, what do we, where do Christians agree? Where is there universal agreement about what God's sovereignty means? Um, and I would suggest that when the Bible praises God as king, as ruler over heaven and earth, think particularly about the royal psalms, but elsewhere as well, um, three things emerge. First of all, that God's sovereignty means that he is over creation. In other words, he is all powerful within creation because he is a creator. So sovereignty and creatorship are really held together in the Old Testament. I think, secondly, another emerging theme that I think we can agree on is that when we read passages about God's sovereignty, we read that God is sovereign within creation. In other words, he is omnipresent. He is present and actively involved in the world he has created. So I think that's the second thing that we can say with some degree of certainty that most Christians would agree on. And the third thing is in relation to the eternal nature of God's sovereignty. So it's not a temporary sovereignty, it's an eternal sovereignty. And that is what marks God's sovereignty out from other forms of kingship that we see within the Bible. So I think that's where the agreement is about, what does God's sovereignty mean in the Bible? But the issue comes when we try to determine, how do we therefore apply that? Because I think what you were hinting at towards the end of your comments there was that there is something different about saying that because God is sovereign, he is free and able to do as he wills. As he wills, the emphasis perhaps should be there in the sentence.
Yeah, yeah,
That is different from saying that everything that happens aligns with God's will.
Yeah.
Does that make sense to you? I
Yeah.
think,
Yeah.
I guess to put it another way is, if we believe God is sovereign, we surely believe that God has the power and the right to exercise that sovereignty in the way he feels fit. So there's some things he will decide to do and some
Yeah.
things that he will decide not to do. And sometimes those things don't line up with our expectations, perhaps.
No. So that's that difference
Um,
between our will and wants and God's will and plan. And sometimes they don't always match up, do
yeah,
they? We can
yeah,
find ourselves praying for something that isn't going to happen because that's not
yeah.
God's will.
I mean, I want to try and emphasise before you think I'm a total liberal and I'm very unhelpful to your church and its congregation. But I'm not suggesting, therefore, um, that God is not able to do what he wishes to do, but that
Mm.
sometimes God chooses not to exercise the full extent of his sovereignty. He allows us to make some decisions about our lives and the way we live them, which do not align with his will. And we surely see that in the fact that we still sin. You know, there's certain
Yeah.
decisions we make in our lives that don't align with God's will and purpose. And I think, you know, you said something about the big picture a bit
Yeah.
earlier on. It just comes to mind here that, you know, I think that is laid out in the Bible from the very outset. When we look at the creation narratives in Genesis, that God created man with freedom. There's a vulnerability and a risk in the way he exercises his sovereignty in creation, even.
Mm.
Um, so, yeah, I don't know if that helps at
Yeah.
all.
Yeah.
Um,
I guess it raises questions around when things go wrong, when people suffer, when bad things happen, and we think, is that so? If you go to that extreme where everything happens because of a reason and
mm-hmm.
God's purposes and God's plans, then does that mean that when a child is murdered, that was part of God's plan? Or do we step away from that and go, no, that's a consequence of the sinful one, and God wouldn't want that to happen? And I guess I'm thinking a little bit with the story of Joseph, when his brothers, they were planning to kill him, but in the end they just sold him into slavery. And at the end of
Mm-hmm.
that story, when we see a reconciliation, you see God's salvation plan working through Joseph for Egypt and beyond, and 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 Joseph says, what you to his brothers, what you planned for evil, God's turned for good. And I guess it's that question: is did God cause it, or has God
Mm-hmm.
turned it from something
Mm.
bad into something good?
Yes, I think the story of Joseph and the story of Ruth have some similarities in this regard.
Mm.
Um, and I think we can certainly tie up this, well, there's two things. I think sometimes with a long perspective, looking back on something,
Yeah,
we can see that God has blessed us in a very difficult situation, and that his purposes have been furthered through a what we might have termed a really bad situation. I think Joseph finding himself in a well, with his brothers talking about killing him, was not a good situation for him. I don't think there's anything good or godly about that situation that Joseph found himself in. But when he looks back on his life, with that long-term perspective, I think that's what you did in your sermon. You were talking about, you know, how you met Jen,
yeah,
and you saw a series of coincidences line up. And then
yeah.
looking back at that, you could say, look, after 15 years of marriage, I'm thankful to God that those coincidences lined up in the way they did, and I met Jen. But
Just
the
say
flip
that was
side
a
of that,
good thing. It wasn't equivalent to being put in a well and threatened with murder. It was a good thing to the
that
people.
is true. Um, but the point is, you're looking back at
Mm.
that outside of the situation. Um, I mean, it raises all sorts of issues for us, I think, practically in terms of our lives, and those very difficult situations in our lives, and those terrible situations that some of us face. So, as you was talking about how you met Jen, and you give thanks to God that he lined up all those coincidences, I'm thinking about, well, what about the person sitting in church seats away from Jan, who for 3 years while they were engaged gave thanks to God for lining up all the coincidence they met their life's partner and what a wonderful man he was, and 3 months into marriage found that they were in an abusive situation. Did God align all those coincidences too? So I think that's the problem we get into when we
Yes.
think that when we assign to God all the coincidences that happen in our lives. Now, we could talk about evil powers being at force as well.
Yeah.
But I think it helps us perhaps to think about what type of sovereignty do we actually believe in. Theologians would talk about general sovereignty
Yeah.
in contrast to meticulous or specific sovereignty. So the idea that general sovereignty would say that some things happen that God doesn't want to happen, but he permits them to occur. He allows them. He doesn't will them to happen, but they happen. They would argue that, God has a goal. There's a big purpose. The salvation of the world, the saving of the cosmos, if you like, the whole created order. So he has that big goal, but he doesn't have a blueprint necessarily about how that goal is going to be achieved. And that's why we're seeing in the Old Testament those occasions where it looks like God changes his mind slightly about how he's going to do something. He's created this perfect world, and then a flood has to come to bring judgment because there's an adjustment according to how humankind develop and the choices they make. Another way of putting this would be to say that, we think that God macro manages the world.
Yeah.
He has this big plan and purpose, but does he micromanage it? And I
Does
think, like
that
you said,
make
there are problems with the micromanagement idea of God's sovereignty. So I'm just trying to tease out a little bit here sometimes the difficulties we get into if we believe that everything that happens is of God's will and purpose. And we can think about the big things like the Holocaust, or the small things like the person who finds himself in an abusive marriage, the car accidents, these sort of things. Do we accredit those to God's plan and purpose?
Because we want to believe that God is interested in my life and the things that I'm doing and the job interview or my holiday or my safety in the car journey on that holiday. And that's good, but then like I said, the flip side is that, well, if something goes wrong, was that because God made it happen, willed it happen, allowed it to happen? We can't have one and not the other, but it causes complications when we get to that micro involvement in our life, I guess.
Yes. I was in conversation with somebody, like I said, in church about this, and they were saying, I really would like to think that God's interested in everything that happens in my life. And I actually thought, do I really want to think that everything that's happened in my life, God has had a direct hand in? I'm not so sure. In terms of that, he's allowed coincidences to work for bad purposes in my life, for things that were negative experiences or negative occurrences. I do think there is every reason to praise God for the blessings he brings into our lives. And whether we decide to call those blessings his coincidences, God incidences in our lives, or how we decide to describe them, is one thing. But I think the problems with the micro management idea of God's sovereignty is that we lose human responsibility, for example, for sin. It doesn't seem to me to line up with Jesus's teaching and message that God has determined where we're going to sin and we're not going to sin, so we don't have to ask for forgiveness because God's made us do it anyway. That doesn't make sense to me. So I think, we run into difficulties in some of these practicalities about what salvation means and why it is important and why we need to turn to Christ. It starts to unpick things for me on that score. To give you another practical example, it makes a nonsense, I think, of prayer if we think God micromanages everything that happens. So why do we pray then if God micromanages everything that happens? Now, as I was reflecting on that, I started to think, well, if I believe God's got this big plan, this purpose, I know what it means to pray according to his will and in line with his purpose. I know his purpose to bring salvation to the world. I don't know what it means in terms of, I don't know what God's purpose is for me in terms of, what I should have for breakfast in the morning.
You
um,
know, where do you
it's
draw
not.
the line? Where's the
Well,
cut-off
exactly. The
point?
difficulty is learning to draw the line. And I guess when it comes to sort of thinking again about prayer, if God has determined every detail, I can't see the purpose of prayer. But if God has has a big picture, and he accommodates to us, and we see some accommodating responses to prayer in the Bible, don't we? Or even, Jesus was set on going one direction and somebody calls him back and they goes in a different direction.
Change his mind.
God accommodates to our
Mm,
wishes and um, our desires when they're in alignment with his will and purpose. So I think that's why I'm edging towards a more macro management view of God's sovereignty, that there is his plan and purpose, and his plan and purpose will be achieved. That's what it means for him to be sovereign. But I don't know if it necessarily means that everything that's happened in my life, I can say that was directly what God willed for me to go through or to experience. And that brings in, the wider questions about evil and the battlefield we're in and Christian warfare and all these other things that perhaps lay a bit
yeah.
outside of our conversation today. But sorry, I've gone on
So
too much.
we mustn't confuse there. From what you're saying, we mustn't confuse God having a macro view with God being distant. Because we can sometimes think,
Yeah,
okay, so God's just stepping out of the situation, bird's eye view, moving chess pieces around the board, a bit like playing a game of Risk or something. And
yeah.
and that's what that's not what you're saying, is it? You're saying that yes, God has a bigger plan, he has a will, there's a direction we are going in, but actually he's also there with us, he's there beside us by his Holy Spirit, influencing us, guiding us as individuals. And I recall the words of Jesus. It says, don't worry in your life about what you're going to wear and what you're going to eat. Your God knows these things, and
Mm-hmm.
look at the sparrows; they don't need to worry about it, and he loves you more than those sparrows. There's this
Yeah,
real
yeah.
intimacy and individuality about God's care and love for us.
Indeed. I mean, it's holding together, isn't it, what we call the immanence and, the transcendence of God.
Yeah,
He is, and we talked at the start, didn't we, about things that we know the Bible tells us about God's sovereignty, that he is here with us in our walk as human beings, that he is part of, he is sovereign over his creation and within his creation. So I think, it's holding those paradoxes, sometimes they're called, together.
yeah,
In our thinking, and I think it causes us to praise him for his presence with us in the darkest times. And you could, go back to Ruth. Surely that's part of the story here, that for this family that find themselves, in a really difficult situation, a difficult period of Israel's history, when there was enmity between their people and God's people, that there was a way forward. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because I just was thinking about what you said earlier about Joseph, and I sort of, I think there's parallels between Joseph and Ruth's story, because um, you know when we think of Joseph's story, I think it was really, really significant in the big plan of salvation
mm,
being worked out. Um, and what does Joseph do? He reflects that promise or that covenant that was made with Abraham at the beginning, to be a blessing to the nations. And that's what he brings about because of God's hand on his life. And to some extent, this is what happens in the story of Ruth. A bad situation is turned good because of loving kindness, because somebody, is reflecting the character of God and bringing God's presence into a situation, and therefore blesses abundantly, just like Joseph brought blessing abundantly. So I think there are these significant moments where God does intervene in very dramatic ways, and we need to be alert to those as well.
mm,
Surely, if nothing else, that's what the incarnation teaches us. And that because Jesus is so central to God's salvation plan, you see God's intervention on that big scale and a very significant moment, as salvation's history plan develops through
yeah.
the person and work of Jesus.
I mean, does it pick up on that? I think it might be a Catholic idea of God's people, the church, being the hands and feet of Jesus. Actually, we have that response. Yes, I believe that God is working in our midst, that God is working in our
Yeah.
communities and doing his thing. But actually, there's that responsibility on us to demonstrate Jesus, to show his God's loving kindness in the way that we treat people, the way we speak, the way we step into people's lives, and help them and guide them.
Indeed. And somebody has said that when God's people show God's loving kindness to one another, that's when God turns up on the scene. We think of some of those horrific periods of history, and people have gone through horrific things on a personal or a national or an international scale, and yet you've still got those stories of, of light where God's presence was felt, where there were reflections of God's love shown to others. I mean, I think Ian on Sunday referred to Corrie ten Boom's story.
Yeah.
And that just comes to mind, that there were these stories of beautiful love, kindness, human interactions happening in the most dire, awful circumstances that we would otherwise term as evil, because God showed up through his people showing love to one another.
Yeah.
So it puts human responsibility back on us. It gives us more responsibility. It doesn't take it away by
It does.
having this view of God's sovereignty.
It does. That when we live out God's calling and in our lives and take seriously the responsibility we have to reflect Jesus in how we act, then that's when God, like you said, that's when God turns up, and that's when situations can be turned around, and when we can look back and see those God incidences that actually weren't necessarily coincidences. They were us doing what we were supposed to be doing, and because of that, we gain blessings because of that.
Yeah. God turning up to bless his people through his people, which is, written in the Bible from the earliest pages to the end.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Deborah, for your input. I think you said at the beginning, as a biblical scholar, you realise there's more questions than there are answers, and I think we come to a nice conclusion, but there are still questions because the great thing about God is he's too big to fit in our head anyway. So there's always going to be questions. But thank you for helping us think through some of these in a bit deeper way, and that's what this is for. So thank you very much. Really appreciate that, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you very much. It's been good. It's been good for me to think about these things, and lovely to share with you. So thank you.
Thank you. Wow, I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. And I've still got loads of questions, and I still don't know exactly how it all works, but that's what it's all about. In following Jesus and following God and being a Christian is about asking questions, because God is way bigger than we can possibly understand or comprehend. So do get in conversations. If you do have questions, you can contact us at gotquestions@hollybaptist.org.uk. And if you would like any prayer, if you have any prayer requests, you'd like someone to pray for you, they will not contact you, they will not pass the prayer request around, they will just pray for you. And you can email us at prayer@hollybaptist.org.uk. So let's do like this video, do subscribe, do share it on social media if you can. We love to just get the word around about Jesus and to share the exciting world of the Bible and the God that we follow. So thank you very much, and God bless.